And one lesson I think the last 20 years has taught us is that you never see the next war coming. Like, who saw 9/11, prior to 9/11, 2001? Who saw the need to deploy 10,000 British troops at a time in Afghanistan for 20 years? Who saw that George Bush would decide that Saddam needed to topple and we'd have to throw armoured battle groups up against, vicious Iran-backed Shia insurgents?
And you think that the urban warfare lessons from inside Gaza will be relevant for a war against Russia as well?
They could not be more relevant.
Joined by Eylon Levy.
Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for being here with us.
Eylon Levy.
Eylon the Record.
Hello and welcome to the very first episode of EylON the Record, and a very special welcome back to the loyal listeners of State of a Nation. I know, I've kept you in the lurch for a few months. Sorry about that, but the podcast is back now. New name, new format, new home here at the magnificent M10 studios in Tel Aviv. The October 7th war is officially over, which means the suit and tie are off. But this is the Middle East. We know how this works. It can all kick off again at any moment. And that's because the longest war in Israel's history ended with an epic season finale, but enough loose plot lines to keep us going for a century. And wasn't it grand? The surviving hostages all coming home in one day. Split screen, President Trump landing in Israel for a victory session in the Knesset, then Air Force One lifting off into the sunset, heading for a global peace summit in Egypt. And yet, that finale left more cliffhangers and unresolved plot lines than any Netflix drama. Hamas in Gaza is still clinging onto power. In Lebanon, Hezbollah is rearming. And the Iranian regime, rocked by mass protests at home, faces open threats of military action from President Trump if it continues its ballistic missile program. Anything from the fall of the Islamic Republic to a second or even third Iran war is imaginable in 2026. The so-called global intifada is still raging. The disinformation war against the Jews continues at full force, and if that weren't enough, we're heading into an election year in Israel, and it's no exaggeration to say these may be the most fateful elections in Israel's history. For 2 years, I was a spokesman for a nation at war, first officially, then unofficially. Now, in what may well be a brief twilight between emergencies, I want to do something different. EylON the Record is where I think out loud with the people whose brains I want to pick. This isn't a news bulletin, it's not a message sheet, and it's definitely not a shouting match. It's a space to put everything on my mind, on the table, and on the record. A safe space. I mean that literally. I think this underground podcast studio here at M10 in Tel Aviv doubles up as a rocket shelter. To talk seriously about power, war, ideas, identity, and the stories we tell ourselves about all of them. Some of my guests will be names you will recognize from television or social media. Others will not. Young thinkers, less famous but no less important, people who are challenging what everyone else takes for granted. I spent 2 years explaining Israel to the world in real time, under fire, literal and political. This podcast is what comes after the briefing room. No clock ticking down to the next headline, no statement waiting to be cleared, just 2 microphones, a guest, and the freedom to think. If you're looking for certainty, this may not be the show for you. But if you're looking for intellectual honesty, especially in an age that punishes it, then you're in the right place. One quick note before we get going. EylON the Record is completely independent and podcasts don't grow on trees. If you want to be a founding subscriber and contribute just $10 a month, you can do it at patreon.com/EylON the Record. In time, we will add new membership options and goodies, but for now, I would really appreciate your support to keep this show running at patreon.com/EylON the Record. If you're a brand or organization interested in sponsoring EylON the Record, then get in touch with us on social media. We're selective, but open to the right partners. Please subscribe to the podcast on YouTube, Spotify, or Apple Podcasts. Give it a 5-star review. It really helps to fight the trolls. And follow us on X and Instagram at EylON the Record. Sponsors can reach out to us there as well. Right, I think it's time to crack on, don't you? My first guest ran something of a spy ring inside the IDF. A whole network of moles reporting back on how the IDF was really fighting inside Gaza. He built an independent picture of how the IDF was actually fighting, not from IDF press releases and not from activists with a narrative to sell, but from the people doing the fighting. So he spent 2 years flying in and out of Israel, quietly cultivating a network of lower-ranking IDF soldiers and junior commanders who were there, on the ground, fighting house to house against Hamas terrorists in Gaza. Over beers and coffees in Tel Aviv when they were out of uniform and off-duty, he grilled them about urban warfare, about tactics, about mistakes, about fighting a jihadist army that had a 16-year head start in turning every inch of Gaza into an urban battlefield. He checked their accounts against each other, against media reporting, against open source intelligence, and the result is a new independent report from the Henry Jackson Society, Tactical Lessons from Gaza, an attempt to answer what actually happened there in the Strip. Not how it looked on CNN, but how it looked on the ground through the eyes of the soldiers. And it matters how that war was actually fought, because if you think Gaza is the last time a Western military will face an enemy on an urban battlefield, you're mistaken. Gaza was not the past, it was just a preview. And it matters how the war was actually fought, because if you think Gaza is the last time a Western military will face terrorists in an urban battlefield, I have a bridge to sell you. Gaza is not the past, it's a preview. Joining me, EylON the Record today, is retired Major Andrew Fox, a research fellow at the Henry Jackson Society after a career in the British Army that saw 3 tours of Afghanistan. Ground control to Major Fox. How are you?
Good, mate. Thank you.
Welcome back to Tel Aviv.
Yeah, great to be here.
I'm happy to see you, but I have to say I was a little bit hesitant about having you as the first guest for this podcast. I wonder if you can guess why.
Well, I suppose once you've started at such an incredibly high level, where do you then go?
It can. Okay, so 2 reasons. Two reasons. One, it can only go downhill. Although I'll promise viewers, we're going to keep going up and up and up. But the second thing is, I really want to branch out of the Hasbara Israel advocacy space. And here you are, having just written a 60-page report that basically says the IDF is freaking awesome and the West can learn not just from its mistakes, but also from the things it did well in Gaza. And I'm wondering, is this just going to be an episode about how amazing the IDF is, and why did I bring you?
Yeah, and that's a really good point. And I would push back exceptionally hard against that. Because what I'm trying to do is report on the IDF as I would report on the British Army, or the American Army, or the French, Spanish, Australian, whoever it might be. And that's with balance, with a critical eye, and trying deliberately to stay away from the cheerleading space. Because I don't think that's any use. You know, there are cheerleaders out there who just say, yes, perfect, always good, no dramas at all. And where's the credibility there? I mean, because no army's perfect. No army's perfect. And you can't expect them to be. And by trying to claim that they are, I think you're doing a disservice because nobody believes you. So I've been really happy in this paper to pull out some really negative points about the IDF. I believe shambles is a quote I used talking about their logistics in Gaza, for example.
Shambles or omni-shambles? Where is it on the scale?
No, I think it's not an omni-shambles at all. I mean, they got guns, water, bombs and food to the troops, but perhaps not as smoothly as it might be, and that's a lesson in and of itself. Because think about it, if we're sending the British Army, 15,000 troops apparently we're sending to Ukraine if Mr. Starmer gets his way.
Sir Keir to you.
Sir Keir, of course. How dare I demote such a fine statesman. But yeah, look, if we send troops to Ukraine, we're going to have to resupply them. We're going to have to get ammunition to them. And if Israel struggled just driving it across the border from Israel into Gaza, then there's some really good lessons about how to keep tabs on your stuff and make sure the troops get the resupply they need. So again, straight off the bat, a really good lesson based on criticism rather than cheerleading.
I want to pick your brains about some of the things you think the IDF got wrong in this war, which makes absolute sense because this is not a war the IDF was expecting to fight, and it basically had to make up a lot of it as it went along. But also to look at what you think the IDF did well that is relevant for Western militaries that may find themselves fighting a war. And hey, with Britain sending troops now to Ukraine, you can't rule out that Britain could find itself fighting urban wars as well. I mean, let's start with the elephant in the room. To most of the world, the notion that there is anything to learn from the IDF's experience in Gaza will sound insane because they look at the civilian casualties, the flattened buildings, the humanitarian crisis, real or imagined, and say, there are only mistakes. There's nothing to learn from. And you actually think the West has something to learn from some of the good things the IDF did tactically in Gaza. So let's look at the glass half full. What did the IDF get right?
Well, I think I'm going to turn that around on you and go with a mistake that you've just highlighted. And that is that the IDF has done a truly dreadful job of explaining all the things that you've just raised. Why are there civilians dead in those numbers? Why is so much of Gaza now just rubble and twisted steel? There are really good military reasons that these things happened. and they would have happened no matter who was fighting in those areas. But the IDF have done a truly dreadful job of explaining that to the world, and we don't need to go into that right now. But
we'll get into it later,
yeah,
because the way the information warfare links into the physical warfare is critical in Gaza.
So.
But on the ground, the way the war itself was fought.
Correct, but you've literally just highlighted a problem there. I thought it was good to flag it because you've literally stepped into it. Stuff they've done well, I think it can be best summarised by talking about adaptation, because as you said, they weren't ready for this war, not at all. They had to mobilise 360,000 reservists in 2 weeks. Now, for context, to get 500,000 troops into the Gulf took 6 months from the coalition, and Israel did 360,000 mobilised in 2 weeks. And of course, that means there were deficiencies in training they had to make up for, deficiencies in equipment, and they had to get over that start line. But it meant they got over the start line, but not in the greatest of shape, quite frankly. If you look at the training programme they went through down at the National Training Centre down in the desert, a month-and-a-half course to get the guys ready to cross the line of departure into Gaza. Again, for context, prior to Afghanistan, a year's worth of training before you got on the plane and landed in Camp Bastion. A month and a half just isn't enough. And there was, frankly, on-the-job training. And we saw some horrible mistakes from under-trained troops. So,
but Andrew, this isn't just about logistics, because if the whole episode are about how the military did logistics right, then I'm unplugging now, okay?
Yeah.
And it's not about training. It is about the IDF rolling into an urban battlefield where the enemy had a 16-year head start in basically turning every inch of Gaza into an urban battlefield, where they're fighting not only above ground, where there are houses, but there are tunnels underground, there are aerial threats as well. You see things all around. And so I'm wondering, from a tactical perspective, how did you see the IDF evolving to create new military techniques on a tactical level to fight this urban battle that countries may face in the future? The IDF certainly was not expecting to fight on the morning of October 7th, 2023.
Let's start with the tunnels. Tunnels is a great example. Initially very, very clumsy underground. They didn't have the specialist troops unique to that. They were using kind of whoever they could get to go in. By the end of the war, they've got a unified tunnel command, that's a fusion cell for all the intelligence and all the operations that are taking place. They've got troops like Yahalom, Shaldag, Shahetet 13, the special forces units are now clearing through those tunnels using incredibly precise technology, incredibly precise tactics. And they're able to get through those tunnels in good time and in good order without losing too many soldiers, which is the critical thing.
Now, I want to linger on that, because the IDF, as we said, was making it up as it went along. I think part of the reason Hamas thought that it could get away with the October 7th massacre is they thought the IDF would not possibly go into the tunnels. And I remember at the beginning of the war, people saying, it's a death trap, the tunnels are booby-trapped, we're not going to send soldiers into tunnels underground. And that's exactly what we did. So, how did the IDF learn on the move to engage with the tunnel threat, which is, what's the latest estimate? 1,000 miles underneath Gaza?
Potentially. Yeah, it's crazy, isn't it? It's absolutely mind-blowing, the scale of the task that faces these troops. So little things like, yes, they are booby-trapped. And so how do you get around the booby traps? They rope into the tunnels rather than climb down the ladders. How do you clear underground?
What do you mean they rope into them?
They literally rope down as if they were absolutely...
Like shimmying down a rope?
Yeah.
How does that deal with...
So if the booby-trapped ladder is there, then they bypass the booby-trapped ladder and they get in that way. Or they dig a hole alongside the original tunnel shaft and go in through their own little mini tunnel.
But hang on, we're sending men into tunnels that we suspect may have improvised explosive devices in them? Why? It sounds like as a layman, a stupid way to deal with a tunnel, because you're risking a human life. Like, why didn't they just flood it with cement? What happened with that idea in the end?
Well, there were some hostages that you might recall were a pretty big concern for the IDF throughout the war, and they were very specific to try and...
But they went into the tunnels. They knew sort of which were the attack ones, which were the tunnels.
Let me finish. There were tunnels down there that they didn't know what was in. There are intelligence assets underground, the Hamas servers, the money they found, the amount of intelligence they've harvested from the headquarters locations underneath Gaza has been incredible. We're talking apparently 40 years worth of video has been pulled off Hamas servers. 40 years worth. Insane. If you watched it all back to back.
Insane. Every anniversary of October 7th, there's going to be new footage for the documentaries about that massacre. And they're declassifying it slowly and releasing it, in due order. So there's some really important stuff underground, and which you would then immediately lose if you just collapsed or flooded the tunnels. Also, flooding doesn't work. They're so deep, so complex.
than actually just pouring explosive in or pouring gas in or pouring water in just isn't going to work.
But shimmying down a rope is not a very high-tech solution, right?
No, but it's a clever, thoughtful solution. And then when you get down, you've got thermal optics on. You're moving slowly. You're clearing in complete silence. That's a huge evolution that's come about during the war. They're no longer clearing through kinetically. They're going through step by step, 100 meters at a time, because that's every obstacle is about every 100 meters. And they're working their way through methodologically and minimizing their own casualties whilst maximizing the tactical gains they're making underground. And this is all stuff they've learned through the war and refined as the process has gone on. And that refinement is the lesson.
I wonder, from your experience working, both with the British Army, of course, but also with foreign militaries, is that something distinctly Israeli in Israel's culture of improvising solutions on the move? Do you think that maybe other armies wouldn't have given soldiers as much wiggle room to improvise solutions on the ground, or am I just giving us a pat on the back and saying, look how creative we are? No,
I think we adapted throughout Afghanistan. The mine clearance procedures that we used in Afghanistan were totally different at the end of the war to the start of the war. All armies adapt. War is adaptation. It's move and counter move. It's that tactical chess game you're with your enemy. But I think what the Israelis do particularly cleverly is two things. First of all, there is a data obsession, which means they have massive information on which to make decisions and make changes. And secondly, there is a system in place to cascade changes throughout the fighting force when tactical innovations or new ways of fighting or new lessons learned have been found, and to get that down through the force so that everyone is singing from the same hymn sheet. Those are two things that I think the IDF does exceptionally well.
Is this something you found from speaking to commanders? They told you, hey, we came up with this great ad hoc solution, and then they find it being implemented across the army. Can you think of any examples?
Yes, exactly that. The medical solution is the one that really jumps out. Quite incredible. The leaps forward in medical care the IDF has come up with, and it's all data-based. So they looked at previous war. They looked at how soldiers were dying, like what mechanism was killing them. They looked at the percentage of injuries that were serious and how many of those injuries survived and why.
Okay.
And they worked out two things. First of all, what kills soldiers? Blood loss. Soldiers bleeding out is what they were dying from. So their answer to that is to get blood to the front line. So no other army I know of does this. They carry refrigerated blood in the medics packs so that when a soldier gets injured, they can straight away start pumping real whole blood into them.
That is so grim.
It's horrible, isn't it? But that's the nature of warfighting, unfortunately. The next thing they looked at is, where do soldiers die? Well, on the battlefield. Where don't they die? Few of them die in hospitals. So why are the doctors in the hospitals and not on the front lines where they can be treating troops? So they're now forward loading qualified doctors, not just the paramedics and the combat medics, but actual doctors are now on, close to the front so they can provide that life-saving care to soldiers. And here's the kicker on the data. There are 600 IDF soldiers alive today who would have died from their injuries in previous wars. On top of that, 33% of the injuries are what you would classify extremely severe. That's much higher than previous wars in Gaza or the 2006 war in Lebanon. And yet the survival rate has gone from 24% down. Sorry, the death rate has gone from 24% down to 9% of those very seriously injured soldiers. So what we've got is people getting more injured, more seriously injured, and yet more of them are surviving because of the medical changes that have been made. What a great example of using technology, using data, and adapting to improve how your army operates.
Horribly disfigured, but at least alive.
Exactly that. And, I've got friends who lost limbs in Afghanistan, and I guarantee you they're far more grateful to be alive than wishing they had died in those incidents.
Okay. So look, the IDF is having to make it up as it goes along, improvise solutions, not only, as you said, technological solutions with soldiers and their health on the battlefield, the tunnels, of course, dealing with, when we talk about what the closest equivalent to Gaza is, whether it's the Battle of Mosul, or some people will take it to Southeast Asia during the Second World War. There's just no other example of a city above ground and below ground and the tunnels. But one of the major problems the IDF had to try to find solutions for was the presence of civilians. The presence of civilians in an urban battlefield where at the beginning of the war they said, please get out of the way, evacuate for your safety. They didn't. Hamas kept them at gunpoint. Didn't help that the United Nations did not cooperate at all with a plan to get them out of the way. And it means that Israel is therefore fighting in a place where the enemy is using them not as, you wrote a report about using them as human shields. I always prefer saying human sacrifices, okay? Yeah. Because Hamas wanted to get them killed, and it's so sick and twisted that people don't understand it, but that was the enemy's goal. So I don't think any other army has quite dealt with the same urban battlefield where people were still there in such a sticky way as in Gaza. And so what did you see from talking to the soldiers? Again, not the IDF press releases, which I'm going to say the IDF is the most moral army in the world, blah, blah, blah. From speaking to soldiers about what actual military tactical measures they put in place to try to avoid harm to civilians, which we don't want, firstly, because we're not monsters and we don't want innocent people to be killed, but also because Hamas is waging this information war against Israel, and every single civilian casualty is then used as a cudgel to undermine Israel's legitimacy, apply diplomatic pressure that then makes it more difficult for the soldiers on the ground to fight. So how are they improvising to protect civilians?
Of course, on top of that as well, as from a soldier's perspective, the last thing you want is civilians anywhere near you because they get in the way. They just complicate things. It's like sand in the gearbox. When you're moving through, and especially when your enemy's fighting in civilian clothing, distinguishing between a civilian and an armed insurgent is really tricky. So there's a third factor,
right? Because they're not exactly running around with name tags.
Yeah, exactly, or holding up signs. It just doesn't happen.
Right. So what does civilian protection look like? Not in a Harvard seminar, but on the ground.
I mean, it does look like what the IDF have described. They do give them phone calls. They do give them text messages. They do drop leaflets. And I would say, actually, most of the soldiers I interviewed said they were fighting in ghost towns. Actually, very few of them, ran into large bodies of civilians. And what they mostly found was that those left behind were the elderly and the young. So Palestinians were bugging out from these areas. And when the IDF cleared through and they found people, it was mostly old people or very young people. So you can draw your own conclusions from that. But obviously, they would slow the pace of operations down. In order to make sure those civilians were out of harm's way. That doesn't mean civilians weren't killed. Of course they were. It's a war zone. Civilians always suffer the most. But certainly I've heard story after story of operations being halted, airstrikes being cancelled in order to get those civilians out of the way. But the lesson here, I think, is the important one, is not so much how you shift civvies. Like we can all shift civvies. That's not rocket science. I mean, the IDF have some really clever tech that lets you know how many civvies should be there and what you expect to see when you hit the ground. But again, not really that important. The lesson here is the strategic one about, first of all, the moral duty to get civilians out of harm's way, the complicating factor of having civilians, and then thirdly, the strategic impact of what happens if you don't do this well enough. And that's the lesson, because yes, the IDF got hammered for the death toll, but actually I think so would we. If we were fighting in, name your city in Ukraine or Eastern Europe, and we called in an airstrike where a huge number of civilians were killed, I guarantee you the Russians or whoever were fighting would take that imagery, would take that event, and would use it to hammer us back home on our own battlefield at home. They would generate protests on the streets of London against them, the monsters of the British Army who've just killed X number of civilians in such a country.
I'm not convinced.
Well, it certainly happened in Iraq.
I don't know. I was in Britain during the Iraq War. No one cared. The media did not cover obsessively every hiccup by every British soldier on the ground. Civilian casualties in Iraq were not the sort of news that civilian casualties in Gaza were. I don't think the British people have the faintest idea what was done in their name to keep them safe from ISIS.
The single biggest protest in London's history was against the Iraq War.
Yes, but it was very much contained to a certain flank of the left.
There's 1 million people on the street.
But it was that part of that movement, as opposed to, it wasn't the obsessive media coverage all the time, certainly not in the granular detail, hour by hour, with an expectation that you turn over immediate information in the way that.
But on top of that was
Gaza
2003. That was pre the age of social media. And what we've seen in Gaza is the world's first real social media war. Now, you can make a case that Ukraine had elements of this, but not in the way that Gaza did. And I think Hamas has taught every malign actor on the planet a lesson in how to degrade the strategic standing, how to degrade the international standing of your opponent by weaponizing social media, by weaponizing bought and paid for old media in order to undermine the what Clausewitz would have called the home front. You know, he spoke about his trinity, which is, you know, a mixture of chaos, passion and reason, exemplified by militaries, governments and people. What they're doing is attacking the third leg of that trinity, which is the people who are so important for support on the home front. Look at Vietnam. Look at how that fell apart because, you know, heavily Soviet influenced propaganda infested elements of campus life, and we saw very similar protests from Vietnam that we saw on campuses in America about Gaza. Hey LBJ, how many kids have you killed today? Was the famous chant that you heard at those protests, and it had a strategic effect on the war in Vietnam. This is that turned up to 11, supercharged by the fact that you can have an airstrike on the ground in Gaza and it can be on people's phones within 30 seconds of that bomb landing. Very, very powerful. It's a new information age we're fighting in. And civilian casualties are going to be weaponized against our own forces going forward. And learning from how the IDF, well or otherwise, handled that is a big lesson for our troops going forward.
Somewhere in Gaza or in Sana'a or Baghdad, your evil twin is recording a podcast now about the lessons that they can learn from Hamas's operations inside Gaza. So I want to use what you said now as a springboard to ask, we can talk about what Western armies can learn from the IDF, and a lot of it is actually very technical and logistical and not necessarily that sexy and exciting. But what lessons are the terrorists and the bad guys learning from what Hamas did well? Because I tried to raise a red flag about this during the war, okay? I saw Hamas operating out of hospitals, press releases from EU diplomats, the United Nations, condemning Israel for then retaliating as if Hamas was not operating in the hospital at all. And I was saying, you're sending the message to terrorists around the world who are taking notes that you now get immunity if you hide in the basement of a hospital. Do you think that Western leaders have tied their hands in future wars by creating unrealistic expectations, by encouraging terrorists to think that if you hide in the basement of a hospital, if you hold civilians at gunpoint and stop them leaving, if you get civilians killed and it goes on CNN, that serves your purpose, that through these unrealistic expectations on Israel, have Western leaders made their future wars harder to fight?
Possibly. It could just be that they go for the pure hypocrisy route and just carry on as normal and ignore what they've been shrieking at Israel about for 2 years. That's a possibility. Secondly, there are things that totally distinguish Gaza from other conflicts. For example, the complicity of the UN, the complicity of the NGO sector, I think is potentially standalone when it comes to...
What do you mean by that?
Well, for example, if you go to Ukraine or you go to fight in Eastern Europe, if you're fighting a tank battle or a drone battle against a peer state adversary, there is unlikely to be an NGO sector who are geared up and bought and paid for, and ready to start putting out press releases about how terrible you are. So that might well stand alone. But certainly what they're learning is, first of all, delete yourself from the battlefield as much as possible for an asymmetric conflict. And by asymmetric, I mean a state actor against a non-state actor. Now, we can debate about the status of Hamas in Gaza, whether they're a state government or not, but actually they were a guerrilla force by the end of the war. And they were operating in an asymmetric manner. So we'll take it as an asymmetric conflict. But if we're ever fighting an asymmetric actor again, delete yourself from the conversation. It's the first lesson. Like, when have you ever heard the number of casualties the IDF incurred in a fight? Have you ever heard that outside of Israeli media? When was the last time the BBC mentioned that the IDF had 3,000 casualties and 900 killed in Gaza? I don't think they've ever mentioned it. To all intents and purposes, this has not been presented as a force-on-force war. It's been presented as the IDF blowing up Gaza, okay, which is so far from the truth, but it's because Hamas have successfully deleted themselves from the conversation. So that's my first lesson if I'm an asymmetric actor. The second one is get underground. Absolutely 100% get underground. That negates so many of your enemy's strengths. The IDF's powers, over Hamas are air power. They're intelligence and surveillance assets. There's drones in the sky. There's signals intelligence. So cut yourself off the communications network and get underground where the enemy can't see you and can't strike you. That's a second huge lesson. And I think the third lesson, that if I'm a terrorist actor looking at Gaza, the third lesson is that headlines win strategic points. And I would make sure that I had a media system good to go before the war even started. I would make sure I had friendly, print media, internet media good to go, influencers good to go, academics good to go, and I would start generating that stuff the second the first round were fired. And And those are the big lessons. Now, I'm not saying that when we fight a peer enemy in Eastern Europe, those are lessons that are super useful right now. But we can't say that at no point in the future will the British Army never again fight an asymmetric actor. And these are going to be important lessons for us in how we expect our enemies to perform when we're taking the fight to them.
It's very disturbing because the terrorists are already preparing for the next rounds and thinking about how they do this. And they will definitely be looking at the extraordinary success of Hamas on the information front, which I want to get to in a little bit, but let's stay in the kinetic sphere. The next round is a matter of time, right?
Yeah.
For 2 years, we were saying, if this is not the last Gaza, I promise no sound bites, but this is one of my sound bites. If this is not the last Gaza war, there will be a next Gaza war, and the next Gaza war will be worse because Hamas will feel vindicated in its strategy. This war ended with Hamas still in power in half of Gaza, controlling a rump territory, but hey, strong enough that today they tried to fire a rocket at Israel, which crashed and landed inside Gaza, by the way, 140 meters from a hospital. So you can only imagine how many Palestinians were killed by misfired Hamas rockets inside Gaza. But Hamas is not going quietly into the night. No international stabilization force is going to take Hamas's guns off it, even if they read Major Andrew Fox's report about tactical warfare and how to copy the stuff the IDF did well. That's not going to happen. And so how do you think Hamas is doing its lessons learned process from this war and trying to double down on what it did well? Clearly it did it well if if it's still standing. How are they preparing for the next possible confrontation with the IDF?
I mean, they could possibly read Major Andrew Fox's next paper, which is about how the ceasefire is not going to work. But that's for a future podcast.
When's the paper coming out?
I need to finish it, so probably next month or the month after.
Oh, okay. Optimistic the ceasefire lasting that long. Okay.
No, I think it's frozen. I think it's the Americans' problem. But anyway, the Hamas have been incredibly adaptive throughout this conflict. And let me give you an example. So let's take the IDF clearing through a building. They know there's a tunnel shaft in there. That tunnel shaft was almost certainly covered by a camera. It had a wire down into the tunnel, and there would be a Hamas operative watching for when the IDF entered the building, and when they entered the building, he would detonate the IED that was laid on top of the tunnel shaft. Obviously, cameras become increasingly hard to come by when you've lost most of them in Rafah because they've all been blown up by the IDF clearing through the place. So what they've started doing is taking the reversing cameras off cars and repurposing them. Great for them because they're much, much smaller than an ordinary camera, much, much harder for a soldier clearing through to spot.
Dash cams are dual use now.
Yeah, dash cams are dual use, and I've seen with my own eyes footage of that this week where Hamas have released the video, or the IDF have captured it, one of the two, I'm not sure which, where even the guy approaching the camera showed up with the red, yellow, green reversing camera spacing on it. So they've just completely repurposed car reversing.
By the way,
cameras.
these cameras play an integral role in Hamas's information warfare as well. I saw one video going viral online that seemed to show, if I recall correctly, a girl getting, well, the claim was hit by an airstrike. But then when you ask, wait, hang on, why was there a camera pointed exactly at her? Why doesn't the camera shake? It's very clear that what happened is she walked into an IED, not an airstrike, and the camera was there because Hamas was trying to catch Israeli soldiers getting blown up. But of course, that then goes viral because people don't ask questions.
Yeah, of course. And why have so many airstrikes been caught on camera? It's because the IDF tell people that the airstrike is coming. So
and the tripod doesn't wobble.
Yeah, so they've got time to get to a safe distance, get the tripod set up, get the cameras on the buildings, and then when the airstrike comes in, they can then slice in some other footage of injuries, and then boom, you've got a ready-made aren't the Israelis evil video.
Are you identifying anything else from how Hamas is preparing for the next round?
Nothing specific yet. They are making a huge amount of money from the aid that's going in. I was in the Civil Military Cooperation Centre down in Kiryat Gat yesterday, and I was shown the daily aid figures of what's going in. It's mind-blowing.
It's astronomical.
Astonishing how much aid is going in.
It's astronomical. I mean, let's put this on the record. We're talking about 850,000 tons of food that have gone into Gaza since the ceasefire. Now, the UN used to say Gaza needs 65,000 tons. Another report upgraded it to 80,000 tons a month. I don't know why, it's arbitrary. But let's say Gaza needs 80,000 tons a month. It means Israel has delivered into Gaza more than 4 times the amount of food that Gaza actually needs. And that explains why Hamas has an interest in dragging out phase 1, not returning the body of hostage Ran Gvili, because it's getting huge supplies that it's able to tax. I mean, there was a report did you see the report in Bloomberg this week?
No, go on.
It explained how Hamas is rebuilding its war machine. It is financing it by... Hamas is financing its war machine by, one, claiming rent from homeless Palestinians in tents on municipal property. And it has also nationalized the cooking gas market. People used to be able to buy cooking gas privately. Now they have to go through a Hamas government commission. And surprise, surprise, businesses are being charged extortionate rates by middlemen in order to get their cooking gas. And Hamas is profiting from all of this. And it's amazing what you said earlier about the NGOs who are aligned with it. And one thing that terrorists will be learning is have your own NGO system, because they're all in on it. None of them are calling out Hamas's abuse of humanitarian aid.
You've probably seen the recent NGO Monitor paper about how Hamas literally had agents in a number of NGOs, like Medical Aid for Palestine. Astonishing.
And therefore, it's not about hijacking aid per se, because Hamas is the government of Gaza. And I kept getting asked in interviews, what's your evidence that Hamas is hijacking aid? I'm like, it's the government. Imposing taxes is what governments do. Where do you think it's getting its money from?
Well, on top of that, I was looking at the screens yesterday. They're tracking all the aid convoys. And I asked how many were getting intercepted. And obviously, during the war, the UN's own figures were saying that 95% of their own convoys were getting hijacked. It's now almost zero. And what does that tell you? It tells you that the aid is going where Hamas wants it to go. They don't need to intercept it. And on top of that, it means the Arrow and the deterrence units that they set up during the war have done their job. They were designed to deter people from A, challenging Hamas, and B, seizing aid. And that's obviously worked. So it tells you that A, Hamas is in total control, and B, that all the aid is almost certainly filtering through their warehouses, through their hands, through their markets. And that is going to give Hamas a huge amount of financial boost.
It's not only a financial boost, it's stockpiles for the next war. I mean, I remember when this one started and the BBC basically, had a bot that every day would push a headline saying Gaza's about to run out of fuel, Gaza's about to run out of fuel. And Hamas was sticking on a stockpile. I can't remember exactly how much, but we illustrated it in terms of the number of times a Boeing 747 could fly around the planet with the amount of fuel that Hamas had stockpiled. But are you seeing any other ways that it's preparing and innovating for the next war? I mean, it went well for it.
The only thing I've heard is that they are still digging tunnels in their area.
They're still digging tunnels?
Yeah, so they're still continuing to dig tunnels. And even, throughout the war, they were digging tunnels.
How do they still have the equipment for that?
Well, it's sand. It's a pretty easy dig, actually. So, they've been doing things through the war, like when the IDF are in a position, they've taken a building, they've gone firm, they're setting up their defensive position. Hamas will dig a tunnel up through new earth to pop up next to the IDF position and open fire on them. So that's been something they've been doing solidly for the last 2.5 years. So that's the way they're coming back together. But we've certainly seen those two units I mentioned, Arrow, and I can't pronounce the Arabic because it's got that sound in it. But the deterrence unit. These have been incredibly effective. They were both set up during the war. They didn't exist before the war started. And they have helped Hamas retain its iron grip over the people of Gaza. All 2 million that are still in that rump chunk of Gaza that Hamas run.
Okay, well, look, let's go for the jugular. If the IDF was so tactically effective in Gaza and learned on the move and found interesting creative solutions, why is Hamas standing after more than 2 years of war? Why was the IDF unable to finish the job?
Look, they were never going to wipe out every last person in Hamas because the place is infested by this organisation. As you said, every ministry, every hospital, every school, every mosque, every government agency, and then on top of that you have a now guerrilla force, and all they have to do is drop their weapon and they're no longer targetable. Unless you know for a fact that person is a Hamas member that's worth expending an aerial munition on. So, you can never winkle out an insurgency just by killing everyone. And they're not prepared to surrender because they become martyrs if they die. So that's a result as far as they're concerned. So that was never going to happen. But actually look at where we are in Gaza. Hamas is neutered as a threat to Israel and have been for well over a year. Like, they cannot strike Israel in any meaningful way that affects the security of the state of Israel. Strategic goal achieved. All the living hostages are home. All the dead bodies but one are home. Basically, strategic goal achieved. Stand fast, the one body that still needs to come home. You know, these are huge wins for Israel off the back of the last 2 years of fighting. I never thought all those hostages would come home.
I didn't either.
You know, I genuinely, I'm not Mr. Trump's biggest fan, but certainly in his plus column is that, a very impressive achievement to secure the release of those hostages. But they were never going to be returned through military force. They were returned through political force by Donald Trump banging Turkey and Qatar together and bribing them. And, there may well be a payoff from that later down the line, by the bribes that have been given to Turkey in terms of F-35s, the power and influence Qatar now has. These are problems for further down the line, but bottom line, hostages are home. These are big strategic wins. And on the final point, in terms of this being a success for Israel, is they've handed the problem over to somebody else. Israel's happy to hold the yellow line until such time as the ISF turn up. The Americans are putting a pretty stiff grip on Hamas to stop any kind of escalation between them and the Israelis on the yellow line. They're routing messages through the Egyptians to say, we've heard you might be thinking about doing something naughty. Don't. That's been quite effective. And actually, the political solution is now Washington's problem. Donald Trump broke it, so Donald Trump owns it.
Not to say that it doesn't present problems to Israel, because look, the genius of the Trump plan was that instead of Hamas having the cards in the form of the hostages as insurance to get an Israeli withdrawal, Israel now holds half of Gaza as insurance that Hamas will disarm, but it has no intention of doing that. And if the United States is going to try to push Turkish troops into Gaza, that's a big no-no. Just on the point of learning about what tactics work and don't, hostage taking.
Yeah.
This war proved that hostage taking works, didn't it?
Yeah, no, I completely agree. The fact that Israel placed such a high premium on those hostages. There were huge areas of Gaza they weren't able to operate in because they knew where the hostages were for the most part. There's a whole unit in the IDF dedicated to finding that, who had a direct line to the IDF chief of staff to say, you cannot go in this area. We know there are hostages here. And it put a huge handbrake on the IDF. Now, would the UK or any other country fight for their hostages in the same way? We've always had a policy of not negotiating with terrorists.
More than that, I read through the British government's counter-terrorism manual from 2018, and it claims that it is against British and international law to negotiate a ransom with terrorist hostage takers. And that is exactly what they pressured Israel to do, to pay a ransom to terrorist hostage takers. Britain, most countries don't do it. And if they do, they claim with a straight face that they didn't negotiate a ransom because they know that it rewards taking more hostages.
And look, there's a context here, and I'm going to make 2 points. First of all, is the odds of somebody stealing British hostages at that scale is pretty slim. They're not going to. It's not as if they're going to take a dinghy over the channel and go and steal people. Don't give them ideas. That would never work. But the odds of hundreds of Brits being taken hostages pretty slim. But of course, there are always Brits around the world who are going to be, targets for abduction by various groups, but not on the scale of Israel. And the second point that falls out of this is that we have to be really careful when we're talking about lessons from another combat zone. And it's a mistake people have made throughout this war. And the amount of times I've seen particularly stupid former generals on Twitter saying, why don't they just do what we did in Northern Ireland, negotiate with Hamas, come to an agreement with them.
It's so stupid.
And what they've done there is they've lifted and dropped Northern Ireland. And the big mistake when you're taking lessons from one war zone to another is to just lift and drop. It's about how it adapts to context and how you can take things you've observed in War A and use them in a slightly different way, or just copy them completely in War B, knowing what you have to leave behind, knowing what's unique to the first conflict, and knowing what can be adapted to the second conflict. And that's the real art, I think, of learning from a war zone. And in my paper, I've been very clear about which lessons I think are applicable, which need a bit of modification, and which are probably only an IDF versus Hamas kind of piece of information to leave where it is.
What mistakes do you think the IDF should be learning from its experience in Gaza? Foreign military should be learning from the IDF in Gaza, because you said, okay, it mucked up in some places, which makes sense. And certainly in Israel, there was a lot of criticism coming, not just from the ordinary groups, but from bereaved families, from soldiers, about the tactics inside Gaza, about the continuous cat and mouse of going into an area, clearing it, withdrawing, and then Hamas goes back in, setting up a humanitarian zone that Hamas infiltrates and starts shooting rockets out of, claims that the advance was way too slow instead of moving in, losing the element of surprise, criticism that actually giving people warnings in order to evacuate and that you're going to attack surrenders the element of surprise, and that out of some goodness we were therefore, in Hebrew they say freirim, suckers. Unnecessary fatalities, soldiers getting killed by IEDs, perhaps not having appropriate, being in suitably protected equipment. And my biggest criticism, a total lack of military discipline around the question of soldiers uploading stupid shit on TikTok. And I'm not talking about soldiers recording themselves necessarily doing anything illegal, but just, first of all, recording themselves in the battlefield and exposing their own identities in a way that then puts them at risk from people trying to get them arrested. Or just, joshing or joking around in a stupid, immature manner because soldiers are bored and trying to keep sane in impossible circumstances. But it looks really bad on TV. Makes its way all the way to international courts. And my impression was that there was no real appetite within the IDF to discipline soldiers, because when you're a people's army that's based on reservists, you sort of got to treat everyone as if they're doing you a favor by turning up to serve. I mean, what if that resonates with? That's me getting my criticism off.
That was a good rant, and I wish I'd been making notes, because I could address.
There is
each
a
of
lot
those.
of pent up frustration from 2 years of war, Andrew.
Right, let's deal with the last one first. Great lesson, I think, because should we ever have to come to a peer-on-peer mobilisation, we will have to draw on some kind of conscription. It won't look quite like the IDF, but
Last time Britain spoke about conscription, it was about doing 1 week a year as a volunteering.
I'm talking a peer-on-peer conflict where we're like, hell, we need manpower now.
Okay.
World War II style, like court draft papers, that sort of thing.
God forbid.
Look, you're going to have young men and women who don't necessarily particularly want to be there, who are used to having their phones on them all the time. Like the mind-blowing stupidity of not taking the phones off these soldiers. I mean, it's an OPSEC threat. These phones can be
operational
tracked.
security for non-military experts.
It's a SIGINT threat, a signals intelligence threat. These phones can be tracked and monitored, and you can, follow units' progress by their phone signals if you've got the right kit. So first of all, incredibly stupid failure not to take the phones off them completely in the first place. And then, as you say, I sat down with Hagari halfway through the war.
The IDF spokesman.
Yeah, the former IDF spokesman. And I put this to him. And I said, look, why have your troops got phones, and why are they not being disciplined for this ridiculous nonsense they're uploading on social media? And to be fair, he turned around and said, go and ask Goldfuss and Cohen, who were the two major generals in charge of the divisions at the time. He was very frustrated that this wasn't being gripped at a command chain level. But I think that has changed. And again, the IDF's learned and improved. There was a video that came out just this week of a soldier firing his machine gun from the hip with no body armour on. It was into an empty area, but it looked terrible. And that soldier's now in jail for 20 days.
Yeah, although I think the army mucked up on the communication side of it, because retweeting the video and not mentioning in your quote tweet of the video that he was shooting at an open space and not at civilian homes as they were already claiming gave it much more validation and oxygen than it needed, but we're learning. And that brings me on to information warfare. It was clear to me that Hamas was fighting two wars, a military war and an information war. To some extent, the information war supported the military war, okay? If you get people to think that Israel is evil and is committing genocide in Gaza, then you try to get the West to pull back its attack dogs to support Hamas's military battle. But I think much more importantly, the military battle was intended to support the information war. Hamas fought a type of war in civilian clothes, under civilian buildings, with the tunnel shafts, in the schools, in the homes, in the mosques, in the hospitals, blah, 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 in order to create the images of suffering that would poison global public opinion against Israel, that would give fuel to a global movement that was already accusing Israel of genocide before October 7th. This is something the crazy leftist NGOs have been trying to do since Durban at the beginning of the new millennium. They were fighting a vicious information war against Israel, where sometimes they would just make things up, take them completely out of context, and it was just a way that they built the battlefield as well. Why do you think that we did such a bad job in fighting against Hamas's disinformation warfare?
Well, you've missed a stage as well from Hamas. Don't forget the 7th of October videos and the live streaming when they were in kind of uniform.
When it was an actual live streamed genocide.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And the messaging there was to their fellow travelers, look how strong we are. Look how strong we are. You know, that was the first phase.
And the New York Times, by the way, had some intercepted communication saying that was explicitly Hamas's strategy, was disseminate the images of the October 7th atrocities in order to excite and inspire people to pick up arms and join in the orgy of violence.
So look how strong we are to Arabs. And then they immediately, the next day, flicked to the Israelis are genociding us to the other audience, which was the West. I think it's a fascinating flick that they were projecting these two things simultaneously. Look how strong we are. Look how awful the Yahud are to us. You know, that's a really interesting paradigm that was somehow missed by world media, effectively, because like Hamas's videos were there. And yet what they chose to focus on was how terrible Israel was. And we can go on for hours about why that might be. But why did Israel fail to counter it? Well, to start with, they were on the back foot so badly. You know, this is something that completely rocked Israeli society, that had Israel completely on the back foot. They spent a week trying to mop up terrorists from within Israel. And one general said to me during the war, you know, I don't have time to fight the information war. I'm fighting the real war. And I've heard that phrase repeated a few times in various outlets as well. But once you've lost the narrative, I think it's incredibly difficult to get it back. Look, mate, you were a spokesman at the start of the war. You know, you were right in this fight from the word go. Ultimately, the narrative had already shifted before Eylon Levy started popping up on our TV screens. And you were effectively having to fight a rearguard battle when it came to, for example, explaining why the airstrikes on Gaza City were as so visually appalling as they were. You know, why was Israel striking these high buildings in Gaza City? Why were, they prepared to take hits on families just to kill Hamas fighters? You know, this was never really explained by the IDF.
Look, I hear the criticism, and I understand it, by the way, from the soldiers and the commanders on the ground.
It's not criticism, it's just observation.
No. Sorry, not your criticism. I understand the soldiers on the ground saying we're fighting a real battle, and we also said this is not a popularity contest. There is a real war, and the information is downstream of that. But I've been trying to convince Israelis, at least, that the loss of international public opinion led to things like arms embargoes in ways that made the physical battle materially more difficult to fight.
The 4-month pause between Khan Yunis and Rafah, you know, that came about through the information
because of international pressure, and so therefore that public relations, if you want to call it that, is an integral part of Israel's national security. But I wonder what Israel could have done differently. And this is, we're not bogging down in PR and messaging. In terms of tactically, the images that are available to soldiers. Like, we keep talking about how Hamas is fighting in civilian clothes and about the nature of this urban battlefield. The IDF never released the plethora of footage it must have from the soldiers' own body cams. Now, I understand why the IDF didn't do that. If the IDF releases footage of soldiers, you know, playing Call of Duty against jihadists who are running around in civilian clothes, the pressure from the Israeli society will be, well, why don't we just call in airstrikes? Why are we sending our guys in on the ground like sitting ducks? And if we released all the footage of Hamas taking over aid trucks, then the pressure would be, you have to stop the aid trucks, and then Israel finds itself internationally in a problem because you want to keep sending it in anyway. But I mean, you have a whole chapter on this information warfare. We lost critical momentum in the first week. What lessons do you have for how any country fighting an urban war against terrorists who are weaponizing the information warfare can fight against Hamas-like tactics? Yeah,
and it may be, I think, that Israel couldn't have done anything really differently. I mean, yeah, they could have released some more bits and bobs and, you know, and tried to stay on top of that narrative. They could have released the 7th of October 47-minute video more widely than they did. I understand why they didn't. Yeah. You know, but it could just be that there's nothing they could have done here. Once they'd lost that momentum after the first week, it was done. So what can we learn from that? That's the important thing. Well, the first thing is, don't lose the momentum. You know, I think we need a massive upgun in our media cells, in our information cells. 77 Brigade do an interesting job. They're very small. They're heavily reservist based. They're the British Army unit that's responsible for this kind of stuff. Secondly, I think getting rounds in the air, you know, at the same time as your physical rounds. So just as you're firing artillery, you know, minutes after that, you should have your information rounds in the air explaining what you're doing and why. Or we might not even need to, because it might not be the same kind of conflict. And when I say these lessons are adaptable and they need to be taken in the context of whatever war you're fighting in, you look at what happened with Israel. You say, right, these things went wrong. This is a golf bag you can now have to say, right, if we're in this situation, we can use a 9-iron. If we're in this situation, we can use a driver. And you look at what went wrong for Israel. You give yourself contingency options ready to go, prepared well before the war starts, so that when the war does start, you've already thought about it. You're already in a position where you can react quickly, where you can react effectively, and where you can make sure that momentum shift doesn't happen in the direction of the enemy.
Foreign militaries are learning from Israel. I mean, just a few months ago, the IDF held a seminar where I think nearly 20 countries came, and they weren't learning how to perpetrate a genocide because they know perfectly well that this was a war against a ruthless enemy in urban terrain. But I mean, this battlefield was just so completely different from the kinds of wars that nations have fought in the past. I wonder, when you look, not from a tactical perspective, but from a geopolitical perspective, okay? What sort of wars could the UK, France, US, Canada conceivably fight in the next 5-10 years, in which lessons about a heavily fortified urban area and the sort of battle that Israel was fighting against Gaza, where could that be relevant? I mean, in what possible universe could the UK need any of these lessons from Israel in Gaza?
Well, we could find ourselves in tunnels in Greenland fighting the Americans. So, that's entirely
Too
possible. But look,
I saw one joke on Twitter saying, the easiest way to solve America's demand for Greenland and refusing to rule out military options is to marry off Baron Trump to the Princess of Denmark and give it as a dowry.
God, I know we were spinning back to the 18th century, but that's next level.
We in Israel have developed, talking about tactical adaptations, a very dark humor. You have to laugh about really dark things.
But okay, to answer your original question and get things back to where we were. Look, combined arms maneuver warfare in an urban environment. Boom, there you go. Incredible lesson to learn.
Okay, break that down.
So let me explain what combined arms is. So in an army, you have armor, you have infantry, you have artillery, you then have an air force. In Israel's case, you even had naval gunfire support. Combined arms is about how you combine all of those things with engineers and logistics to achieve maneuver, i.e. how do you get from A to B using all these assets to shoot you through or to lift you through, whatever it might be.
So physically moving troops from A to B?
Yeah, from A to B. So if building is here, how do I get there to assault it? Okay, what I'm going to do is use my artillery. I'm going to use, that's going to keep the enemy suppressed. I'm going to use precision airstrikes to take out key targets. I'm going to use my tanks to get me forward. And then my armoured personnel carriers with my infantry and are going to rock up on the objective and we're going to clear through the building. That's combined arms.
Logistical stuff.
Yeah. And
not very sexy.
And the IDF are incredibly good at that. There's a lot of bang. There's a lot of bang in manoeuvre warfare. Okay. And, the last time the British Army did a full-on combined arms manoeuvre battle group assault was in Helmand in 2007. And I know that because I was on it. It was literally the first thing I did out of training. And I'm lying there in the forming up point with my brand new platoon, looking at their brand new 1-pip second lieutenant. We've got artillery in depth. We've got mortars firing. We've got the Viking vehicles. We've got an infantry footbridge over the canal. We've got all sorts of stuff from the machine guns on a flank. We've not done that since.
In 20 years?
Yeah. Okay. And guess what? The world has moved on. Technology has moved on. That wasn't even in an urban setting. That was in, the Helmandi desert. So we've not done a proper urban assault like that, probably since 2003. And even then, in Iraq, we didn't use the full suite of firepower available to us because it was a slightly different battle and we didn't need to. There are some amazing lessons about how to coordinate between platoons moving forward in a fight. How do you make sure that you don't, when the buildings are turned to rubble and everything no longer looks like your map, how do you make sure that platoon A doesn't shoot platoon B by accident? How do you command and control in that environment? How do you coordinate firepower coming in? And the Israelis know all of this stuff.
In what conflicts could the West find itself having to fight these sorts of wars and needing to combine? I mean, what do you think the threats are? Russia?
Yeah, of course, Russia. We're literally about to put 15,000 British troops in there. We never know how that's going to go. And one lesson I think the last 20 years has taught us is that you never see the next war coming. Like, who saw 9/11? Prior to 9/11, 2001, who saw the need to deploy 10,000 British troops at a time in Afghanistan for 20 years, who saw that George Bush would decide that Saddam needed to topple and we'd have to throw armoured battle groups up against, vicious Iran-backed Shia insurgents.
And you think that
Basra.
the urban warfare lessons from inside Gaza will be relevant for a war against
Completely
Russia
relevant.
as well?
They could not be more relevant, because
We're going to see Russian soldiers running around in civilian clothes fighting from tunnels under hospitals?
I'm talking about the coordination and the way you move through an urban environment, and all those lessons about how you navigate, how you don't shoot your own troops by accident, how you coordinate with airstrikes, how you bring in the fire support assets that you've got. This is all entirely relevant, be it against a Russian enemy that's in uniform or be it against an insurgent enemy in civilian clothes. These are completely relevant lessons, because this is not an easy thing to do. It's very, very hard to take a battle group and have them singing all from the same hymn sheet, all singing the same tune and everything going perfectly smoothly. Like, that takes a lot of practice. It takes a lot of coordination. It takes a lot of thinking at the staff officer level. And the Israelis have just spent 2 years doing all of this. And they're an incredible asset to draw on to see where they went wrong, where they went right, and what could have been done better, and then how we can adapt that for a British Army battle group.
No one sees the next war coming, just like the Spanish Inquisition and October 7th. And Israel will have to be learning lessons wherever the next surprise come from. As we said, loose plot lines on all 7 fronts. Andrew Fox, how can people follow you on social media?
So I'm Mr. Andrew Fox on X, or Mr. Andrew Fox.
Why Mr.? You're a major. You're a retired
I'm deliberately
major.
trying to move away from major. I'm not a major anymore. It's a bit in the British
You don't
Army.
keep the title?
No, well, you do, but in the British Army, it's considered a bit gauche.
Because in Israel, over a certain rank, like, you keep that title for life. It's a status
I've
symbol.
got above field officer rank, so above major for us, you keep it for rank, but it's not a status symbol. And I've got friends in the British Army. If they see me cutting around calling myself Major Andrew Fox, they'd be rolling their eyes and calling me a knobhead. So,
Are they going to call you a knobhead if I end this podcast by saluting you?
I mean, tuck the thumb in, mate.
Tuck the thumb in. Thank you so much for coming, Andrew. Thanks. And that's it for this episode. If you found the conversation useful, please make sure to subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, or Apple Podcasts. And a 5-star review really helps. Follow the podcast on Twitter and Instagram at EylOn the Record. And if you want to help keep the podcast independent, you can support us at patreon.com/EylOn the Record. And if you want to go further and sponsor the show, then reach out to us on social media. This episode was filmed at the M10 Studios in Tel Aviv. Thanks for joining me, EylOn the Record.